Our guest today is internationally recognized menopause educator Clarissa Kristjansson. She teaches women and men, I think, all around the world how they can transform their menopause journey from one of challenge into empowerment to go through the menopause with kindness and understanding. She would love everyone else to release the stress, the lack of confidence, and body image issues and guide us towards a sense of clarity and control so we can ride out the storm.
You're listening to the Declutter Hub podcast, bringing you tried and tested, no-nonsense tips and advice from the leading experts in decluttering and organising your home. Now here's your host, Ingrid Jansen.
This podcast episode is sponsored by the Clean and Tidy Home Show. The Clean and Tidy Home Show takes place at Excel London on the 8th and 9th of October 2022, and everyone is welcome. Visit to get all the tips, tricks, tools, and motivation you need to clean, organize, and take control of your home. Go to cleanandtidyhomeshow.com for more information and to buy tickets. We'll be there, and we hope you will too.
Hello and welcome, listeners. I'm Ingrid. Welcome to episode 209. If you're new to the Declutter Hub podcast, you're so welcome here. What you'll find is reality, empathy, and advice by the bucket load. And if you've been listening in for a while, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for listening in week after week. We just wanted to remind everyone that you can also watch this podcast on YouTube on our YouTube channel, or just go to the show notes, declutterhub.com/209, and you can find everything you need there. Now, I would love to introduce to everyone Clarissa Kristjansson. Leslie and I had the pleasure of listening to her talk about this menopause topic during our annual conference of the Association of Professional Declutterers and Organizers. And Clarissa explained everything so well that I was nudging Leslie when we're like, Leslie, we need to get Clarissa on the show and tell us more. So welcome, Clarissa. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Ingrid, for inviting me. And thank you, Leslie, as well. It was great meeting you. And I'm excited to share with your listeners more about menopause.
Well, I'm going to come clean, Clarissa. I don't know a lot about the menopause, and I've now delved into your book, and I've listened to a couple of podcast episodes because I'm like, I feel like I'm woefully unprepared. But I think one statistic really shocked me, and in that you said that in your talk, 1.2 billion. And I was like, what? So tell us a little bit more.
Oh, yes. That's how many women are very shortly around the world in menopause. That's a huge number. That's the size of China almost. And that's an incredible number. And yet we're still not able to talk about it properly and openly. We're still very confused. And really, it's time to change that.
I hear you. I'm on the barricades with you. So, especially because I think I can learn a lot from this podcast as well. So I'm very happy. So I hear the terminology, menopause, perimenopause, postmenopause. Can we start at the beginning? And can you just explain to me what this is and what's the difference?
Oh, that's a great question, Ingrid. Yes, terminology matters. But let's keep it simple. Perimenopause is when all your hormones are fluctuating, starts commonly, but not for everybody, sometime in our mid-40s. So when we go around thinking menopause is about old people, it's not. It's about midlife women. And just remember that the top end of the millennials, the top end of Gen Y, are turning 40. So they're soon all going to be in perimenopause. But this is really when we feel all those symptoms that we talk about, the brain fog, the hot flashes, the weight gain, and the 40, 50, however many symptoms there are, they seem to grow by the day. Then you have menopause. And although we use that term as a kind of overarching term, really from a biological perspective, it is the one day, 12 months after you last had a period. If you don't have another menstrual period after that, you are then post-menopause. That's a horrible term. I hate that term. I think I like queendom and queenager and wiser woman. Technically it's post-menopause. But, you can still have symptoms. You can still be having hot flushes and still having some other menopause issues like joint pain and even our brain fog after that period, because we're still declining hormones for quite a while, especially estrogen, until we get to a kind of new baseline. So simply, peri is the chaos, menopause is one day, and post is when the body slowly starts to settle into the new hormonal balance that we will have as we age.
Thank you for explaining that, because the terminology makes sense, but I think it's really good to have clarity on that, because there are different stages. And I think we all, so far, it's all been kind of thrown in one heap, right? The menopause. And I hadn't even until recently realized there's actually such a thing as peri and post-menopause. So I'm really glad that we talked about that. Now, symptoms, you mentioned a few. The list can be quite extensive. It doesn't mean everybody gets everything, right? There are lucky souls, I think, that get everything. But what kind of symptoms are we talking about here?
Well, I like to put them in buckets. So I think there are real physical symptoms, hot flashes. We can have pain, we can get itchy skin, we can feel, sort of sore. And you think, why have I got a funny joint pain? Or why have I suddenly got back pain? And then we can have worse stuff like migraines that are hormonally related. My mom had those. But then we have the mental issues. So they are anxieties, very common. We can't sleep. We can feel fatigued. We can feel panic. Some of those, and depression, and some of those can be quite significant. And then there are the ones we talk about all the time, these vasomotor ones where we're hot or cold, because we can have cold flushes. Some people do, and we can have night sweats. So there's lots of different types of symptoms. 34 is the number we usually talk about, but I've heard 85 quoted recently. I'm not sure that I would put everything you experience at this time of life as down to the menopause.
Okay, that's good to know then. So, how do people start to recognize kind of things when they start to get perimenopause? What kind of things happen to women?
It usually starts in the brain. And I read a great statistic from Professor Jayashri Kulkarni. She's a women's psychiatrist at Sydney or Monash in Australia. I think she's moved uni now. But she said menopause starts in the brain 5 years before your body actually feels any change. And I think that's true. We notice that we're not sleeping so well. We're more sensitive to stress. We start bursting into tears and we don't really know why. I'm sitting in my car crying about the world. We get anxious. And we think a lot of it is to do with the fact that we're stressed. And of course, stress makes all of that worse. But it's really the start of hormonal changes that impact important centers in our brain.
Okay, yes.
Yes, so that's where it starts. Yeah, so that's what we notice first. And then we notice all the classic stuff. We put on weight. Later on, most women will get hot flashes much later, maybe 2/3 of the way through, that you'll start to notice the hot flashes. And then progressively, we get more symptoms that are related to estrogen loss, the joint pain, the itchy skin, the dental issue. The list is very long. But it really goes in stages for a lot of women. Of course, you don't have all of the symptoms, and you don't have all of the symptoms all of the time. You have your unique cocktail. Unfortunately, we don't know what that's going to be, and we don't know how long it's going to last.
Okay, that's good to know. So we can't kind of, because I as a professional organizer, I'm like, okay, when is this starting? When does this end? It doesn't work that way, does it, Clarissa?
No, it works in its own way. I mean, some of this is related to your lifestyle. It's related to your genetics. You could have a look at the sort of impact that your mother had. It's related to lots of things that are outside of your control, your education level, how much you grew up in poverty, trauma you've experienced, toxins you've been exposed to. We can't control lots of those things. What we can control is what goes on in here, which is obviously a lot of my work, and what we put into our bodies, what we eat, what we drink, how we move, and how we try and take care of ourselves.
Yes, you mentioned indeed mothers, and I actually been meaning to ask my mother about it because when I started thinking about menopause and when I heard your talk, I had a flashback to a holiday in Spain back in the 80s, seeing my mom going, I'm so hot, like the whole time, the whole holiday. And that's kind of the only thing I ever really realized from it. And I don't think we ever had a conversation about it at the time, or it was not really spoken about. And I've got on my list to talk to her about, like, what do you remember from this time? Also maybe to kind of mentally prepare myself a little bit, because if it's a bit genetic, I need to know what she went through so I can kind of prepare myself, I think.
Exactly. I mean, asking your mother may give you some clues.
Yeah.
What I do say is, and you saw that in my last book, that a lot of women there went to their mothers and mothers went, well, I had a hysterectomy, so I don't know. Of course, you don't not have menopause, but you don't have a prolonged one.
Yeah.
So a lot of women of our mother's generation really didn't experience this 3, 5, 10, 15 year long journey that many women today are having.
Yeah. I think the same. I think my mom had an hysterectomy too. So I'm gonna have to now talk to her about it. It's just really strange that you never kind of talk about these things, right? And is that what you see, that now you've opened the conversation up, that all of a sudden a lot more people are talking about this?
Yeah, and everywhere in the world. You know, I've started to notice the conversation is popping up in India. There's a fantastic group called Menopause Uganda. Who thought that women in Uganda would come together in groups and march on the street and have men joining in talking about menopause? That's happened in the last few years.
Yeah.
Obviously, the conversation is enormous in the UK and kind of bigger than anywhere else in the world. But everywhere we go, women are starting to open up. And men are coming along to the journey as well and saying, we need to be part of this because it impacts us too. So it isn't just a women's thing, it's a people's experience.
Yeah. And that's why I specifically said, and men around the world in my introduction, because I thought men are such a big part in this journey, I think. And I mean, you know, they need to be educated, and they're so important as a supportive system as well. They need to be involved, I think, in this.
They do, and they have their own version of menopause. Obviously, they don't have menstruation, so they don't have menopause, but they do have andropause. And that is a decline in testosterone for men. Lots of the symptoms look similar. And we've often sort of went, oh, yeah, midlife crisis or whatever, but it's real. They can feel depression, they put on weight, and they generally experience a decline in muscle mass, just like we do. So we shouldn't dismiss that. And I think the strength will come when we join together and say, this is our midlife experience. For most people, it is a midlife experience. And how can we support each other wherever we are in the world?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, you're right. I mean, here in the UK, there's a massive movement. Of course, we have our fantastic TV presenter, Davina McCall, has been very much involved in this almost revolution. She made a TV program about it a couple of years ago. And everyone, just Twitter, social media, everybody was talking about it, and it became into magazines, and it suddenly became this thing. And she was such a fantastic, I think, figurehead to spearhead this whole revolution, I think she called it. And she's now done a follow-up program a couple of months ago. And I didn't watch the original one. I tried to actually find it and I couldn't, but I still want to watch it. But I saw the follow-up show, and she actually said herself that she could not even have fathomed the things that happened after her first show.
No, and I think for the UK, that's opened up a whole different approach, which hasn't happened for the listeners in places like the US or in Australia. The conversation is at a lower level. It's not as celebrity driven, though I'm happy to see Natalie Portman and whatever we think of Gwyneth, she's out there talking about it. And they're also investing into femtech that is providing long-term, possibly non-hormonal solutions to this. And I think that's a fantastic way forward. And for celebrities to actually put their money into this is good, because it helps the rest of us feel we could invest and benefit too.
Yeah, I love that. So how come you know so much about this topic? I mean, it's not like of course it's very big, but it's kind of very niche at the same time. You know what I mean? How come you're such an expert?
Well, it's 17 years ago since I went through my own menopause. But when I was working as a mental health professional, so that's really my daytime job, is that I'm a mindfulness practitioner and I work inside a mental health clinic, supporting psychologists, psychiatrists, and psychotherapists with mindfulness. And I kept getting all these women. They come to my own mindfulness classes. They were all midlife. They were all struggling. They were being told by the professionals, it's generalized anxiety disorder. But there was such a pattern of sleeplessness, anxiety, mild depression, not feeling I can focus, concentrate. I'm having issues in relationships, issues at work. And I started to think, well, this sounds like me. And I started to dig deeper. And suddenly menopause was there. And I actually then went on to train to become a menopause health coach so that I would understand. I did training with the British Menopause Society with Dr. Joanna Hobson too, so that I have a good baseline understanding and I can actually speak about menopause, not as a clinician, but as a educator, and also to work with the women who come to our clinic who need support.
That's fantastic. And are you using your own life experiences as well? Or are you trying to kind of go, okay, well, that's me, that's in my, and I'm trying to get a broad view? Or are you like, yes, I've been there?
Well, I'm a bit, yes, I've been there, because I think that's the empathy piece. But of course, situations change. I mean, I'm in my 60s now, and obviously I'm out of corporate life fully for many, many years. So how it's met at work now and the pressures that women experience are somehow similar, but also somehow different. And so I tend to draw on what is latest thinking and practice, knowledge, science, so that when we talk, we're talking from an impartial point of view, because my experience is unique to me too, as it's unique to anybody that I'm working to or speaking to. We have our own journey because we've got to this point in our own unique way too.
Yeah. Well, listeners, I think we need to go for a little break. And I have a lot more questions, so I can't wait to come back, because of course we need to know more about menopause and how it affects decluttering. So let's talk about that after the break.
Hi, just a short break from this week's podcast episode to tell you about our discovery calls. Maybe you aren't sure if a membership or a course is quite for you, or you would like to know exactly how our membership or courses work. You're going to have so many questions, which is completely understandable. So why don't we hop onto a discovery call so you can ask away? It's just a 15-minute call and it's completely free. No catch, just a simple chat with Ingrid or I. Find out more on declutterhub.com/discovery.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast about the menopause. And you might think, well, that's a bit random. I thought I was listening to a podcast about decluttering and organizing. But when I heard the statistic that 1.2 billion women in the world are all in menopause at the moment, I thought, well, a lot of women who have struggled with clutter and disorganization in our membership, in our Facebook group that listen to our podcast, there must be loads who are now as well in the middle of menopause. So I think it's very important to talk about this topic. So I invited Clarissa on and she kindly agreed. And I've been listening to everything she said so far. But Clarissa, let's talk a little bit, because you talked about the symptoms that different women have. How does that affect people in their homes, in their lives, and when they're decluttering and clutter and disorganization?
Well, I think that does that on lots of levels. I think on the one hand, it's a big change in the middle of our life. And menopause often is that moment when we start to think, how do I want things to be? Because we're changing, our brains are changing. Okay, we're foggy, and we'll come back to that conversation in a minute. But actually, we get a different sort of brain when we've been through this. It's much clearer, it's much more creative, it's much sharper. And we start to let go. We start to let go of roles that we've had. It comes at a time of life where if you've had a family or maybe a relationship, or you've cared for your parents, you might start to say, well, actually, that's now my past. Now, how do I want things to be? And I think that also coincides with maybe how we want our homes to be, how we want our careers to be. And we start shedding and decluttering the things that don't serve us going forward. So I think it's intimately tied to that reevaluation of who we are and who we want to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what we see a lot is that a lot of women are still caring for children, whether they're younger teenagers or beginning 20s, and the kids are trying to figure it themselves out after going to school. But on the other hand, women are, parents are getting elderly, relatives are getting elderly, they take care of them as well. We're the famous sandwich generation, aren't we? We get pulled in lots of different ways. And then and your home is such an important part of the place where you feel safe and happy. And when you struggle with clutter and disorganization, it's really hard to keep all those balls in the air. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, if we then struggle with lack of sleep and stress and anxiety and a foggy brain, it's a lot. It's a lot to do and to take care of.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the midst of that big hormonal change, we often feel so close to burnout. In fact, we know that midlife women are often diagnosed with burnout. They have adrenal fatigue because just juggling too many balls in the air. And if everything is chaos in your home and there's all this clutter along with all the responsibility, it's just too much. I mean, the women that I see in the clinic, they're all burnt. They're burnt out. They have had to have time off work. Sometimes they have to quit. 10% of menopausal women quit their jobs because they can't cope. Or they're looking and saying, well, maybe I have to put lots of things on the back burner, or I have to go part-time. So there is this inability to cope with just so much responsibility that we have. And women are very unsupported. As you probably had on your podcast before, women are very unsupported. We do 75% of all home-related duties, whether they are physical or emotional, are down to women to do. And so when you're struggling with all these additional symptoms, it's just almost too much, and we need more help.
Yeah. Yeah. And what can we do? What kind of help can we have? I mean, does it start with finding a cleaner to help you clean your house? I mean, is that what I need to think about, for example? Or what kind of help are you thinking about?
I sometimes think we have to do one thing first, and that's stop. For a moment, just if you can, stop, even if it's for a short period. And start to look. I work a lot with women where their energy is going and not going, because if we're completely out of balance, we just continue in a spiral down to the bottom of the exhaustion funnel. So sometimes stopping and, with the support of someone, evaluate where I am. Where is all my energy dissipating to? Can I give some of those jobs to other people? Find a voice that says, I need your support. we need to say, well, what's good for me? What makes me feel better? And how do I get more of that into my life, so that we start to move into a more balanced situation between where we are and where we want to be. It won't be perfect, but that's what practices like mindfulness and building more rest into our lives lets us do. That's really a good baseline. Then you might decide, yes, these are tasks. I need a cleaner. I need help from a declutterer. I probably need my partner and my family to help me. Now, not everybody who's in menopause, of course, is married and has children, but we still need help. And I think that's the big part of it. We can't do this journey on our own anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I know that because you talked about it in your talk at the conference, that how important sleep and rest is. But a lot of women in menopause, a lot of them mention that sleep is like, yeah, right, 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'm like, wide-eyed, bushy tails, 4 o'clock in the morning. Why am I awake? Do you encourage people to take like a nap throughout the day, to have just a rest moment? What would you say about that?
I think that I separate sleep from rest because I think they're quite different from each other.
Okay.
But sleep, we need to have a very proactive approach to sleep. If we can't sleep, the biggest thing then becomes actually our mind. Our mind is like, eyes wide open, every thought, every problem, everything. And actually, there are very good techniques to learn how to sleep. And sometimes going to work with a sleep expert who helps you to rewire your sleep using cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance commitment therapy is really beneficial. And I'd say to your listeners, check out the work of the Sleep School. One of their founders came on my podcast, Dr. Catherine Laderley. She's based in London, but they're an international, and they teach people how to learn to accept if you're having sleep issues. And they've taught tens of thousands of people to sleep again. And I think that is a corrective and correct way to manage sleep better, because it's very hard to do this. And I'm a big component, as Kat is, that we shouldn't just then turn to relying on tablets and props, and even meditations, lovely as they are actually outside props. We have it within ourselves to correct our sleep. Hard when you have very bad hot flashes, but then that's a conversation with your clinician too. But rest is taking time for yourself. Rest is stopping consciously and doing nothing, which is almost an anathema to our modern world. Do nothing, but do nothing for 10 minutes every day is restorative for you. Just lying back and resting in a deep rest approach. That's when I teach yoga nidra techniques, because you can do 10 or 15 minutes of absolutely nothing but listening to somebody's voice, nowhere to go, nowhere to be, and just let the system settle a bit. And over time, that builds up to a different way of meeting the world.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think we always put ourselves last, don't we? We take care of everybody else and put ourselves last on the very, very long list. And one of the things that Leslie and I teach here in the Declutter Hub is be kind to yourself. You know, you're not going to change your house if it has a lot of clutter and disorganization. It's not going to happen overnight. So give yourself some grace and celebrate those wins. Be proud of what you've achieved. And it starts with being kind and not putting yourself down. And I think the same is very much related to menopause. It's like, yes, it is here. Let's not fight against it, but let's see what we can do to make it better for ourselves. And you also mentioned that food and diet, of course, is a very big part of that, don't you?
Absolutely. It's a holistic approach to managing this time of life. But you're so right, Ingrid. Kindness, putting yourself higher on the list, and knowing that this isn't going to be fixed overnight. This is years we're going to live like this. So, and we've had decades of being the other way as well, wired to being always on, doing a million things, that doesn't support us. So it's not going to be suddenly switched around from pressing a meditation app or just saying you're going to do it, or I'm going to declutter, a cupboard. It takes a lot of conscious effort, intention, and then action to change things.
Yeah. And what I remember from the Venus TV program is, for her also exercise was a crucial part in her journey of kind of trying to make sense of it all and cope with everything better.
Absolutely. Exercise is vital for many different reasons. Firstly, it's good for our mental health because we actually lower our stress, and therefore with lower stress, we're also helping our sleep. But we need to exercise because we lose muscle mass. Everybody who ages loses muscle mass, and we need to keep that up and have strong core strength and good muscle mass, because that's also a way to prevent us from having trips and falls. It's important for our heart, and it's important for our bone and bone strength and density, because women are at high risk from heart disease and osteoporosis and dementia as we age relative to men. And exercise plays a key role along with nutrition and stress management.
Yeah. So now, Clarissa, you mentioned when we said, we were talking about the podcast and what we wanted to talk about, you said, I really want to talk about becoming the wiser woman. I love that, but can you expand on that?
I think that's a lot to do with what we want to be, what I talked about, what we want to be as we get older. I mean, we've lived a life. We've got a lot of wisdom and knowledge. And I think rather than seeing menopause as the end, which has been the conversation for a lot, this is the end of my life is over, I'm now fading into invisibility. Women are now really changing and shifting that and becoming these wiser women. We see it happening, but I'd say mostly in the US, but it's happening in other places too, where we're stepping up and saying, I can now make a contribution that's different to my life, to my society, to my community. We're not all going to be, Kamala Harris, who's 55. We're not all going to be, what is her name? Iris, who's just done the thing with H&M. But we are going to be able to shift and change our careers. 60 isn't old now.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful series running in the Guardian newspaper about people who've changed their life fundamentally when they reach 60. They've completely, or a bit older, and completely upended it because we can. And I think that's being a wiser older woman. We're following our hearts, we're giving back to society, and maybe we're leaving a legacy too.
Yeah. Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing, Clarissa. I really, really love that. Now, you've written 2 books about the menopause. You've got a podcast. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit more about that so they can, if they're interested, they can follow you? We'll put all the details in the show notes. Don't worry, listeners. You don't have to now grab a pen or anything like that. We'll put everything in the show notes, declutterhub.com/209. But Clarissa, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. So I've got a podcast called Thriving Through Menopause, where I interview beautiful guests from around the world, and we talk about the whole aspects of menopause. So we're not so much focused on the medical side. There are lots of brilliant clinicians doing that, but we talk about what it's like to be a woman at this stage. We talk about positive aging. We talk about important lifestyle factors. We talk about psychology and culture and society, so that we talk about the things that really impact our life. And so listeners can find out how they can start reevaluating menopause. And rather than seeing it's just this horrific thing I have to struggle through or resist, it's actually a way to take proactive action and become an advocate for themselves, and work with maybe some of my wonderful experts who come on, share their own stories, and share how they're helping women too. So that's my podcast. It's obviously everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then obviously I wrote 2 books. I wrote The Mindful Menopause 4 years ago. I'm a mindfulness practitioner, so it's very much a mindfulness book as opposed to, shall we say, a menopause book. But it really shows how stepwise mindfulness can be a supportive way to approach this time of life. And then this year, actually, when we were away at the conference, I released The Potent Power of Menopause, which is an anthology of people from around the world who are very culturally diverse, because even though we are 1.2 billion women, the voices are very, at the moment, I'd say, Anglo-Saxon, heteronormative, and really menopause is a people's experience. So we have people from India, we have people from Sweden, from Filipinos backgrounds, people who are 80, we'll have a man author in there, to begin to slowly unpick the different experiences and to maybe make us just think, wow, menopause can be so different and yet so much the same, because even though everybody's journey was fundamentally different in every way, and how they approached it was different, the transformation in their lives was there for each and every one of those authors.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, I think there was one lady who said she was only mid-30s when she started having symptoms, and she was like, I don't understand this at all, because we all think that menopause is something when you're 50 or 55. And so I think she got sent around the houses for a while, because nobody could even fathom that she was having the menopause, because she was still a lot younger. So I thought that was very interesting. Same on your podcast. I've been listening to a couple of your episodes, and the stories are the same but so different, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the real clue, that the stories of our lives are very different, but underneath it's very much the same. And I think that's the power, the collective power of 1.2 billion coming together and demanding that our voices are heard, that we are taken better care of, and that we can speak about this with a bigger voice.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you advise our listeners, if our listeners are now sitting at home thinking, this all sounds familiar, this is me, the Clarissa's describing me, what do you advise people to do?
I think the first thing is to really get to know yourself. Before you run to any clinician and start asking, get informed, find out about what's going on. There are good websites. Go to a nationally recognized one, North American Menopause Society, British Menopause Society. The facts on there are correct. And then tune into yourself. What are you experiencing? What's going on with you? Because there are things that you can do to change things yourself by being aware. You can maybe change your diet, cut back on your alcohol, think about what your exercise looks like. And then I would say, if you want help, go with an informed to your clinician and say, I'm experiencing X, Y, Z. I'm doing this, that, and the other. Now, what can you do to help me? Because if we get there and say, well, I don't feel very well, then unfortunately, many of us are just going to get pushed a medication and pushed out the door, or at best, or ignored, which also unfortunately happens, or gaslit, because much as I love clinicians, that's quite common that women don't get the support they need. So we need to go more assertively and advocate for ourselves, but we can't do that from a place of no knowledge.
Well, I love that. So listeners, I hope that this has been an informative podcast for you, that maybe some light bulbs. We love our light bulbs in the Declutter Hub. You guys know that. So maybe you've had a light bulb while listening to Clarissa and going, yes, that's me, and I need to do something about this, and I'm going to take her advice on board. And so many fantastic resources Clarissa has mentioned, and I will re-listen to this podcast and definitely put those in the show notes as well, because I want to put them in so you guys can find that. Well, Clarissa, thank you so much for your time, and I know you are a very busy lady, so we appreciate you being here today and talking to our listeners.
Ingrid, thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Well, listeners, let us know in the show notes your comments. I
I would love to read from you what you think and how you feel and what your next step is and what's happening with you. So leave us a comment. I'm gonna be on that. I want to see what you guys are saying to us.
Thanks so much for listening to the Declutter Hub podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us in your podcast player so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you next week.